Now, if you looked in your bulletins, you saw that this might be a kind of a different name for a sermon title. But this seems to be the time of year where everywhere you go, no matter where you go, you're reminded of death and the supernatural. People decorate their front lawns with fake tombstones and make-believe cemeteries. And there are plastic skeletons and fabric ghosts hanging from porches and storefronts everywhere. And you can even find candies this time of year that are in the shape of ghosts and zombies and coffins and things of that nature. And one night out of the year, little children dress up in their scariest costumes as they go door to door seeking a sugar rush. And every fall around this time, Hollywood comes out with the newest horror flick, trying to give thrills to an increasingly hard-to-shock generation of youth. And I would imagine that this is probably by far the most popular month for horror movies in general. In fact, I was just reading in the paper the other day how the Mount Vernon Public Library showed free scary movies all night long last night for anyone who wanted to come and watch them. And they do these sort of things because people are interested in them. People will come when they do this. I know that the Licking County Library has done similar things, and they have even invited paranormal investigators to come out to the library and have programs downtown on more than one occasion. Society likes talking about the supernatural, and humans enjoy a good ghost story. But my question is, why is that? Now, of course, Halloween is right around the corner on October 31st, and that day gives the world an excuse to talk about these things without the fear of sounding like a kook. But is it just this one day a year that places this fascination with death and the paranormal into the psyche of the human race? Or is there something deeper involved? Now, this might come as a surprise to you, but believe it or not, with what it has turned into and become, Halloween itself actually started out as a Christian celebration. And it's part of a season known as Hallowtide. And the word Halloween is a derivative of All Hallows Eve, which is the evening before November 1st, which the church calls All Saints' Day. And it was a time that was originally set apart by the church to honor godly Christian men and women that have passed on before us. And the church had some very interesting ancient customs during this time where some congregations would have their parishioners come to Mass dressed as deceased Christian saints in their honor. And the poorer people, as well as many children of the parish, would be able to feed themselves during Hallowtide season by doing what was called souling. And souling meant that they were walking door to door in their villages, accepting food that was something that was specially baked for this, that was called soul cakes, in exchange for praying for the homeowner's deceased relatives. And this celebration of the dead saints and these customs of dressing up and going door to door eventually morphed into what Halloween is today, which is basically a fascination with death. And of course, children are still dressing up and going from house to house. Only now, the little rugrats demand the candy and they don't even bother to offer a prayer anymore. But while Halloween has evolved into a season where humanity outwardly expresses its obsession with the macabre, this day in and of itself is not the sole reason for our interest in the things not of this realm. You see, mankind doesn't need a holiday to remind us about death and the unknown, the things that we don't understand. These things are already on our minds. And even as Christians, we're all well aware that one day death is coming for each and every one of us, and then we have to cross over and something else is going to take place, and it's going to be very different from what we're experiencing right now. Last Sunday, for our closing song, we sang the lyrics to one of my favorite old hymns, Softly and Tenderly. And the third verse of this old song proclaims Christian truth when it says, "Time is now fleeting, the moments are passing, passing from you and from me. Shadows are gathering, deathbeds are coming, coming for you and for me." Now, we recently lost another longtime member of this church. She hasn't been able to attend here for a while, unfortunately, but she has been a member for quite some time. And the other night, after the service, during the meal, I came up here into the sanctuary, and I stood up here by myself for a few moments watching the slideshow of pictures that they had set up and listening to the music that was playing along with it. Now, I never got the opportunity to meet Miss Velma that passed away, but in just a short period of time, I got to see pictures of her from pretty much all the stages of her life. And yet one picture in particular of her as a late teen, early adult came up on the screen, and it really caught my attention and stood out to me. Because as I looked at it, I saw a young lady that had this big, beautiful smile on her face. A woman that was very full of life in this picture, and she was in her prime with her whole future in front of her. And you could almost sense the excitement that she had of everything that was to come just from this one picture. But then as the pictures flashed, and I watched her get older and older, the sobering reality hit me that I was now at that woman's memorial service. And for a brief moment, the seeming futility of life kind of struck once again. I saw just how fast it all goes by and what is coming, just like it says in that song. And you see, this is what causes the fascination that we have. It's what makes Halloween so popular to the world, because it's a season that dares to talk about the unknown. When we are here in this body, we know what we're dealing with. Like the young Velma, we have all sorts of things to look forward to. Yet death opens us up to another experience altogether, one that we don't have a clear understanding of. And those of this world who don't have hope of Jesus Christ want to still be assured that there is something more to their future when they leave this earth. They want to know that their loved ones are still in existence somewhere. No one wants to think that they're just gone completely. And that is why people sit around campfires and they tell ghost stories. It's why there are paranormal investigators. It's why there are mediums and seances and Ouija boards, because society at large is afraid of the unknown. And they're looking for anything at all that will give them some sort of hope or peace that there is more to the story than just closing their eyes one final time into darkness. Now, when I delivered Tilly's eulogy several weeks ago, I mentioned in it how the human mind was never designed to deal with death and separation of a loved one. And likewise, I also say that it's not designed to deal with our own mortality either. And because of that, we do one of three things concerning death. We either come to peace with our mortality through the promise of everlasting life by accepting Jesus Christ, or we live our life out ignoring the facts about death altogether, going about our daily routines, thinking that we're going to live forever. And many people do this. They just never even consider it, and they never really give a second thought to their own demise until they're forced to face it through illness or through experiencing it with one of their family members. Or we can live our life in absolute fear of the inevitable, and we obsess about it to the point where the reality of our death controls our actions and makes us constantly worry about the people and the things that we will lose or leave behind. And this fear of the unknown causes an unhealthy interest into the supernatural that can sometimes open spiritual doors that should remain closed. And that is what I want to talk about today. And that's also what's going on in the text that I want to read to you this morning. Now, not that many people realize that there is a ghost story right in the Bible. And it's a good one too, because it provides for us a lesson about the consequences of dabbling in spiritual matters that we have no business messing around with. Now, to give you a short summary of what is going on in the text that I'm about to share with you, King Saul was having a really difficult time in his life. And because of his consistent disobedience to the Lord, God, who had put him in his position, had now departed from him altogether, and had also sent the prophet Samuel to tell him that the kingdom of Israel was going to be taken away from Saul and given to someone who would obey the commands of the Lord. Now, on top of this, the king was probably dealing with some serious mental illness. After the Lord departed from him, there was some things going on where, just reading the text, you can see that the king was not completely with it. He was a very troubled man, and his instability and insecurity had led him on several expeditions to track down and to try and kill David, because he knew that David would eventually succeed him as king of Israel. And to put the icing on the cake of all of these problems that King Saul was having, the Philistines were also gathering together to go to war against the nation of Israel. So he was about to have to lead his men out into battle. Now the prophet Samuel, who had kind of helped him in the past, although the prophet Samuel was also the one that had told him because of his disobedience he was going to lose all this, but this prophet had died. And so he didn't have that anymore as an avenue where he could go to, and God was no longer answering King Saul by any means. So in his fear, and with seeming no one else to turn to, King Saul decided to seek out the witch of Endor to see if she could provide for him an answer from the other side. So if you have your Bibles with you this morning, turn with me to the 28th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. And I'm going to begin by reading in the 3rd verse, and I will read to verse 20. And it says, "Now Samuel died, and all Israel mourned him, and they buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had removed the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Then the Philistines gathered themselves together, and they came and camped in Shunem. So Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams, or by lots, or by prophets. Then said Saul to his servants, 'Seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her.' And his servants said to him, 'There is a woman who is a medium in Endor.' So Saul disguised himself, put on other clothes, and he went with 2 of his men, and they came to the woman by night, and he said, 'Please divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whom I will name to you.' The woman said to him, 'Listen, you know what Saul has done, how he has eliminated the mediums and necromancers from the land. Now why are you laying a trap for my life to cause my death?' And Saul swore to her by the Lord, saying, 'As the Lord lives, no punishment will happen to you for this thing.' Then said the woman, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' And he said, 'Bring up Samuel for me.' When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, 'Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul.' The king said to her, 'Do not be afraid. What did you see?' And the woman said to Saul, 'I saw a divine being ascending out of the earth.' And he said to her, 'What is his appearance?' And she said, 'An old man is coming up, and he is covered with a robe.' And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he kneeled with his face to the ground and bowed himself. Samuel said to Saul, 'Why have you roused me to bring me up?' And Saul answered, 'I am greatly distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me, and does not answer me any longer by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you might make known to me what I should do.' Then said Samuel, 'Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? The Lord has done for himself as he spoke by me. The Lord has torn the kingdom from your hand and has given it to your neighbor David. As you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. And moreover, the Lord will deliver Israel with you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also deliver the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines.' Saul immediately fell full length upon the ground, because he greatly feared the words of Samuel." And the words of Samuel the prophet came true. The very next day, Israel was defeated, and King Saul died in battle. Now, there are a lot of theological implications involved with the story that I just read to you. And in fact, the early church leaders never quite came to a consensus on what they believed really happened. Did the witch of Endor actually have the power to contact the dead, as the text implies? Had God made just a special one-time exception and brought Samuel back in order to teach Saul a lesson? Or had the witch contacted a demon that was pretending to be Samuel? These were many of the theories that the early church had. And there are a lot of questions, but one thing is for certain. Something did happen. The Bible states very clearly that Samuel himself did return, and he wasn't happy about it either. In verse 15, he asks Saul, "Why have you roused me to bring me up?" The New King James Bible translates it as, "Why have you disturbed me?" In other words, what in the world are you thinking? You know what you're doing is wrong. And you can sense the tone of Samuel's disapproval of Saul's actions when he further says, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy?" In other words, why are you seeking information from the dead? How can I help you? You don't need any new information. I'll tell you exactly what God told you before I died. The kingdom is being taken away from you because of your disobedience, and it's being given to David. And if you had spent more time talking to God and less time being selfish and disobedient, then you wouldn't be consulting spirits right now. You see, Samuel was angry because Saul was still choosing to be disobedient. God had warned Israel in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 6, against doing the very thing that King Saul had done. In that verse it says, "The person who turns to spirits through mediums and necromancers in order to whore after them, I will even set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people." But I want to point out to you that God never said that there is not spiritual activity going on in this world that we do not understand. And he never said that people who dabble in witchcraft will not experience things that we cannot explain. But he very emphatically did say to us, do not mess around with these things. And King Saul was not innocent in this matter because he already knew that God had prohibited Israel from doing this very thing over 400 years before he ever became king. And the Bible even tells us in the text that we just read that he himself had already prior removed the mediums from out of the land to prevent this very thing from happening. And yet now here he was not only breaking God's law, but he was breaking his own ordinances as well, desperately trying to find some answers to his questions because of the mess that he had gotten himself into. And we as Christians are not innocent either when we start messing around with the occult. The Bible is clear, and the prohibition remains just the same for us today as it was in King Saul's time. And it is also a mistake for us not to take these matters more seriously or to simply write them off as foolishness or children's stories. And I'm not talking about silly pretend psychics that we see fooling people giving them a line of nonsense and trying to make $1 at carnivals and street fairs or those 800 numbers that used to be on commercials. I'm talking about serious inquiries into the dark arts and the occult that does go on even in areas such as this. A pastor that I know locally has a parishioner in his congregation that used to belong to a witches' coven that met secretly right here around Martinsburg. And you all heard my aunt last week talk about how out on the Navajo reservation, still to this day, human sacrifice is still being performed in secret by people trying to gain demonic powers in some of the darker, more traditional religions going on out there. And the Bible instructs us not to mess around with this stuff. Whether it be something as small as consulting tarot cards or playing with the Ouija board or something even larger than that. We are to leave these things alone whether we take them serious or not. And this is not just some arbitrary law laid down by God with no purpose whatsoever other than to just keep us from having fun either. God knows that we are messing around with things that we don't understand, and we're opening up doors to the work of evil spirits in our lives when we mess around with these things. Now, I worked for about 4 years at a company on Schrock Road in Westerville, and there was a woman that also worked there that just sat a few cubicles down for me for just about the entire time that I was employed there. And she was a really nice woman, and I genuinely liked her, and I think I had a pretty good work relationship with her. I mean, we didn't really talk about anything too much personal, but we had a pretty good rapport. But one day after working with her for some time, I'd already been working there for a while, I heard through a coworker that this woman was claiming to be a medium, and additionally, that she was telling this coworker that my deceased grandmother had contacted her from the other side with a message for me, but that she was afraid to come to me and tell me about this because she didn't know how I would react to it. Now, my grandmother had committed suicide just about 3 years prior to all of this happening. And her death was very rough on me, as it was the entire family. And it had sent me into several years of depression, and I've told you all the story before of how I blamed my family for her death and even accused several of them to the police of murdering her. And that was really what I believed, because I did not want to accept the reality of what the situation truly was. and I was full of anger and hatred, and I was blinded to the truth, and I was most certainly wrong with my accusations, but it was a very long and painful process of coming to the realization of what had really happened, and it took me 10 full years to contact one of my relatives and ask him for forgiveness for all that I had said and done. But this incident with my coworker took place in a time when these emotions were still raw inside of me, and when I was still believing this lie, and I was not very strong in my faith at all. And in fact, looking back, I can tell you that I was not really a Christian during that time, and I certainly was not living the Christian life. Now, even still, I was very skeptical of what this lady was saying. But my broken emotions and my general curiosity got the better of me, and I decided that I wanted to go ahead and confront this woman and ask her about what she was claiming. And so she started telling me that my grandmother's spirit had come to her and had given her this message for me. And so I decided that I would test her first. So I started by asking her personal questions about my grandmother and my family. And she answered every single one of them correctly. However, I thought to myself at the time, she could have picked these things up in conversation over the years or from others that know me, and I really needed more hard evidence from her. So I decided to ask her a very personal question, one that only one other person in my family, other than my grandmother, even knew the answer to. And this was a very old and very buried family secret, and this woman, without hesitation, immediately responded with the correct answer. And I'll never forget how chills ran up and down my back, and I actually had to walk away for a moment. And I started to believe that this woman was telling me the truth. And then this woman started giving me details about the night that my grandmother passed away, and she described the house, which was in Maryland. She had never seen it, and she had never been there, obviously, and she described personal items that belonged to my grandmother, and she told me where they were, and everything that she said was absolutely 100% correct. She did not tell me one thing up to this point that I had to question or that was not true. And she even described to a T the layout of my own house and told me that my grandmother had visited me there several times. And I got this house after she had passed away. And seeing that I did not have much faith at the time and that I had no real understanding of the Bible, I was 100% convinced at this point that this woman was literally tapped into the other side and talking to my deceased grandmother. So I was baited, and whatever she was going to say at this point, I was ready to believe. And so fully convinced, and with no doubt, I came to the conclusion that this message must be important. So I asked her what it was. And she said, "Your grandmother wants you to know that you were right. She says that she did not commit suicide and that she certainly was murdered. And if you will continue searching and continue fighting, then eventually the truth will come out and the police will listen to you." Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you this morning that I am still 100% convinced that she was tapped into something spiritual, but I can guarantee you, as sure as I'm standing here this morning, that it was not my grandmother that she was communicating with. Because that message was designed to keep me imprisoned in hopelessness and on a futile mission. That message was intended to keep unforgiveness in my heart. And its goal was to keep my family in bitter opposition with one another, separated from each other after a terrible tragedy when we all should have united instead. And all of those principles of that message go directly against what Christ instructs us to do as His followers. And that message absolutely succeeded in its mission, because emboldened by this message and believing it, I continued to hate, and I continued to be frustrated, and I continued to believe a lie about her death, and that almost drove me into complete madness and suicide myself, all because I thought that I had really heard from a loved one on the other side, and that now I had a mission in life to defend her honor. And I continued to believe this until years later, when I finally became a born-again Christian and I began reading and studying God's words and saw my errors. And the Lord changed my heart and opened my eyes to see how I had actually been hurting others. And this is when I saw the truth. And that is when I saw, as Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14, that even Satan fashioneth himself into an angel of light. Or in other words, the devil deceives us by making us think that we are communicating with something innocent, or something that we can trust that would never lead us astray, especially when we are in vulnerable moments of our life. And He has a knack for making us think that our sinful ways of life are actually righteousness. And that is when most people seek these things out and they get deceived in this way. When they are in vulnerable moments of their life. When they are seeking peace from the other side. I had lost someone that I loved dearly, and when this woman told me that she was talking to her, and when she answered the impossible questions for me, there was no way that I was willing to believe that she was communicating with something sinister. Something that wanted to keep me from my relationship with the Lord. And more importantly, to keep me from peace and from having Christ. But that is exactly what happened. It kept me in bitterness and with hatred in my heart when the Bible says in 1 John chapter 3, verse 15, whoever hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life remaining in him. And yet that's where I was. So evil disguises itself as something good. Satan fashions himself as light in order to bait us because he knows that all humanity is missing something. We're all in a search to fill that void and to gain some sort of knowledge of what is coming, just hoping that there is something more on the other side. And as Christians, we can answer those questions for people by providing them with the truth. They don't need to be like King Saul and be confused and seeking some sort of consult from dead spirits. That is why Samuel, when he was brought up, he asked Saul, why are you asking me these questions? What people are missing in their life, that void is Christ. There's a void in them because they don't have that relationship with the God who created them as relational beings. But they can have an assurance that there is something more to their life after death. And they can also become secure in where they are going when they reach that other side. But not through talking with spirits and demons, but through a relationship with Jesus Christ. But someone has to tell them the truth before they can believe it. And that is why Christ established the church. It is our number one priority. And if we don't tell them, then they will seek the answers elsewhere. And as we can see, Satan is very good at what he does, which is deceiving us into believing other things. So if I could leave you with just one closing thought this morning, it would be this. The world is certainly hungering for something. And Halloween is not the cause of that hungering. On the contrary, Halloween is a byproduct of it. And there are two sides that want to feed the world's hunger and answer the important questions for them. And one side is very convincing, but its answers will only continue to imprison our hearts in bitterness and confusion, intentionally trying to rob us of our peace. However, the other side literally went to the cross in order to set prisoners free and to give us that peace and to offer us hope. So this Halloween season, instead of getting frustrated and angry at the world for celebrating death and the supernatural and a pagan holiday, use it as a golden opportunity to open a dialogue with people who are obviously searching for the hope of something more. Tell them that they don't have to consult the dead for their answers, because the living Christ has made a path for them to go straight to God. If you would stand with us, our closing hymn will be number 183.